Hello and welcome. In this episode, I am going to share crawler encounters I came across on the internet. These stories include a young woman who came face to face with a being thought to be a crawler one night, someone whose friend was seemingly attacked by a creature, and a young woman and her sister who saw a creature multiple times over the course of a year. But first, we will start with a story from someone who had a creature take a disturbing interest in them on their grandparents' farm. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from Missouri, where the original poster, or OP, has had multiple encounters with what she believes to be a crawler on her grandparents' farm. She does not say where exactly her story takes place, just that her grandparents live in central Missouri and have owned the farmland they live on for nearly 40 years. She begins her post by saying that she has always been skeptical of the paranormal, never having really believed in anything like that. But after having witnessed something strange and unnatural on her grandparents' farm, she is shaken to her core. She has visited them more than 10 times, and every time she goes there, she is overcome by the feeling that something is watching her, almost as if it was right behind her. She admits that it is a terrifying feeling. She describes her encounters there as strange and downright bizarre. The first time she saw the creature on her grandparents' farm was when she was somewhere around 7 to 9 years old. She and her family had brought their silver lab on the trip with them, and she was out exploring the forest with her dog. It was a nice summer day with a refreshing breeze as she and her dog explored the area behind the house. But then her dog began growling, which she describes as deep and sinister, a sound she had never heard him make before. She spun around to see what her dog was growling at, but saw nothing but trees upon trees within the forest. But as she scanned the trees looking in the direction her dog was, something shot out of some brush, moving so fast it was gone before she could even tell what it was. She stood there for what felt like forever, dumbfounded at what she had just seen. She said it looked like a coyote, but the speed at which it moved was absolutely insane. It also made no noise whatsoever as it sprinted through the forest. However, she says the creepiest part of the encounter was that there was no imprint in the foliage from where the creature had been hiding after it jumped up and ran away. Standing there in shock by what she saw, she decided it was time to head back to the house. Her second encounter took place when she was 10 years old. The first day of her visit was uneventful other than the creepy feeling that she was being watched. But that night was when things began to happen. She was lying in bed in her uncle's old bedroom trying to sleep when she heard something tapping on the window. She describes it as not small taps on the glass, but rather tapping almost loud enough to be considered banging. She slowly sat up in bed and looked over at the window, but saw nothing. She thought it was probably just an animal or something and laid back down. But after about 5 minutes, just as she was about to drift off to sleep, she heard a loud bang on the window. It sounded like something big had slammed directly into the window. She shot up in bed and grabbed a flashlight from the bedside table, shined it at the window, but again saw nothing. She stared at the window for a few minutes, but still nothing. Now afraid, she decided to go sleep with her mom in her bed. So she ventured forth from her room and started making her way to her mother's room. As she did though, she heard something screech in the distance that pierced the peaceful summer night. And she knew, even at 10, that it was a noise that no human could make. She says she can't think of any other words to describe what the screech sounded like other than dark and horrible. It is a sound that still haunts her to this day. She froze where she stood, paralyzed by fear. But then her instincts kicked in and she took off running to her mother's room, climbed in bed somehow without waking her, and cuddled up next to her for the rest of the night, but was unable to go to sleep. All she could think about, as she puts it, was that horrid, terrible, bloody screech. Her third encounter with the creature happened when she was 13 years old. She was again visiting her grandparents and was having a nice time with her family when her grandfather suggested they go out deer watching. The OP agreed because it was something she had always enjoyed doing there, so they drove out to the easternmost pasture because that's where they usually saw the most deer. They went out at approximately 6 or 7 in the evening, parked, and waited. They were there for about 30 minutes before they spotted a few deer, but then, out of nowhere, that same familiar feeling came over her. She felt like that thing was out there with them, lurking in the shadows, watching her. But this time it was way more intense than her previous encounters. She felt like something was directly behind her, but every time she would look, there was nothing there. However, this time her grandfather was with her, and she noticed that he looked like he felt the same presence she did. She points out here that her grandfather was the jovial type, always laid back, joking, and having a laugh. The only time she had ever seen him very serious was a few years prior when her great-uncle passed away. But in that moment, he went from happy and having a laid-back expression on his face to suddenly very serious and alert. She noticed that his grip on the steering wheel tightened and his knuckles began to turn white as he continuously surveyed the area. Out of nowhere, he whipped the car around and began driving back to the house. The OP asked him what he was doing, and he said it was time to go home, but in a cold voice she says sounded like he had just witnessed a murder. He was gripping the steering wheel even tighter now and had the gas pedal pushed all the way to the floor as they flew back to the house. When they arrived, he rushed her inside while looking around before closing and locking the door behind them. By this point, the OP was very alarmed by the way he was acting and finally decided to just ask him what was going on there. He looked at her with that serious, stern expression and said there were some things he needed to tell her. So he sat her down and explained to her that there was something living on their property and had been since they moved in. He and the OP's mother had some previous experiences that were just like what she had gone through, and the being on his property, whatever it was, did not like new people being on the land. That's why she had experienced some of the things she had and always felt like she was being watched while there. He went on to tell her some of his own experiences there, and they were very similar to what she had experienced herself. He also told her he knew the creature would take an interest in her, so they had always kept a close watch on her. It was getting late by that point, and he did not want her sleeping alone, so he had her sleep with her mother and they left early the next morning. The last two incidents she mentions in her story did not involve her, but were very strange occurrences involving animals. Her sister got a horse that they took to the farm for her grandparents to keep there. She describes the horse as being very friendly and not at all shy. The morning after the horse's first night there, the OP's grandfather was out doing his normal chores. He went to feed the horse but noticed it was acting strange. It was being extremely timid and acting shy. When he went to take a closer look, he was shocked by what he found. There were 3 10-inch gashes down the horse's side that looked like something had clawed the animal. They dismissed the injury as the horse running into a fence, but the OP thinks otherwise. Around that same time, the OP's grandparents got a 2-month-old Jack Russell Terrier. Unfortunately, 5 days after they adopted the dog, he was found dead with puncture wounds on his body and his neck slashed. They chalked this one up to mountain lion or bobcat, but again, the OP thinks otherwise. It would definitely seem that the grandfather has it right about this creature not liking new visitors to the property. It seems to me that it's a territorial thing and it gets protective of the property when a new person or animal shows up. Whatever the case, it definitely took an interest in the OP, and this isn't the first story I've heard where these creatures come messing around someone's window at night. This one seemed way more aggressive at the OP's window than in other stories I've heard. My guess is that it was trying to scare and intimidate her into leaving its territory. It's a good thing the grandfather was clued in on this thing's presence there and how to handle it. It's unfortunate what happened to the animals at the end of the story, especially with the dog. She doesn't say what ultimately happened to the horse, but I'm guessing it's fine. What do you think is lurking around her grandparents' farm? And what do you think they could do to get rid of it? The next story comes from a poster who has had recurring sightings that had been happening over the span of a year when she posted her story. She was living at her sister's house in Georgia at the time and decided to move out due to the encounters she and her sister kept having. She does not say where exactly her story takes place. After having her several encounters or sightings of this being, she told her brother about what was happening, and he suggested she research online what she was seeing. He is really into the supernatural and believed that the OP saw a dog man, but she wasn't so sure. She found some stories online where the description of the creatures matched what she saw, except these stories were about crawlers. So she decided to post her story alongside other crawler stories and see what people thought. The first time she saw the creature in question was one night when she looked out the front door to check outside before letting her dogs out. At the time, she lived in a community of townhomes where people had all types of dogs, including aggressive ones that weren't kept on a leash, so she made sure to check her surroundings before letting her dogs out. She looked out her front door and saw something she at first thought was a dog, but it didn't quite look like a dog, and she wasn't wearing her glasses. When she put her glasses on and cracked the door to get a better look, instead of a dog, she saw an extremely skinny creature that looked more like a person on all fours pretending to be a dog. Adding to the oddity of this being, she says the way it was walking did not look quite right. She immediately slammed the door and called for her sister to come see this thing, but when she looked back, it was gone, having seemingly vanished into thin air. The area where she saw the creature was across the street from her townhome, where it was heavily forested. She dismissed what she had seen as a dog, being that she was very tired, believing she could have hallucinated the weirdness of the sighting. She mentions here that she has lived in Georgia her whole life, and the weirdest thing she has seen to that point was a drunk man trying to ride a dog like a horse. She spoke to her older sister about the creature, and that's when she told the OP she had also seen it a few times when she was coming home from work. A few nights prior to the OP seeing it, her sister was pulling in and her headlights lit up the creature before it turned and ran into the woods. She refers to it as the creepy white dog, but when she sees it, she sits in her car for a while just to make sure it's gone before she gets out to head inside. Some of her other family members they have told about this thing has told them that it's just a dog and it is nothing to worry about. She ends her post by saying if someone were to get down on all fours, raise their back up just a little, and tried walking in that position, that's what the creature was doing when she saw it. Again, she says it looked very much like a human pretending to be a dog. They haven't seen this thing's face, but that's okay with her because she says she is afraid to even begin to wonder what this thing looks like. I know the brother said it was possibly a dog man, and she did say it looked like some sort of weird dog, but I still think this could be a crawler. The way she describes it as being very skinny, and her sister calling it a skinny white dog, meaning it had pale colored skin, I do not think it's a dog man. No dogman I've heard of while researching cryptids has ever been described as looking like what the OP and her sister have seen. Dogmen in the encounters I have read and told on this channel are described as being either black or brown or even gray, very muscular and tall. People who see them usually think they are looking at a very large wolf at first. Being that the OP immediately thought weird dog means this thing couldn't have been that big. Therefore, I believe this was a crawler. What do you think it was? The next story comes from a poster who encountered what he believes was a crawler with two of his friends. Not only that, but one of his friends was seemingly attacked by the creature. He does not say where his story takes place, just that they were in a large park with a lake that was surrounded by large grassy hills. They went to the park to hang out by the lake after school one day, but being that it was winter, it was dark by the time they got there. When they arrived, they settled on a hill that backed up to a forest with thick shrubbery directly behind them. While they were hanging out, one of his friends, who we will call Jay, who was the loudest, started whistling and shouting so he could hear his echo. But as he did this, something in the forest behind them whistled back. It sounded almost exactly the same as his friend's whistle. The three of them looked at each other confused, but his friend continued to whistle back and forth with whatever was in the woods. The OP says he was almost convinced it was just the echo, but the second answering whistle would sound after the echo had faded. Then his friend made a mistake, yelling at whatever was in the forest interacting with him. What they heard in return caused the OP's heart to drop. A reply came in the form of a faint, rough scream. The OP and his other friend H talked about leaving, but their friend, who was yelling back and forth with whatever was out there, wanted to stay and see what it was. Once talked into staying, the OP and H followed J toward where the sound was coming from. He points out here that there was a trail about 200 feet to their right that led to the main road. As Jay approached the brush and foliage where it sounded like the noises were coming from, the OP and H were straying off course toward the trail that would lead them back to the main road and the park's exit. As they did this, they were pleading with Jay to just leave. Jay then began claiming he saw something when asked by the OP. He said there were eyes looking at him from within the bushes. The OP thought his friend was just messing with him at first, but then something darted out of the foliage into the moonlit park and was headed straight toward Jay. What the OP saw was, by his estimation, was a being that was at least 6 feet tall, was very skinny with long limbs, and had a head that was the size and shape of a human's. The OP and H looked at each other and took off down the trail at the same time, with Jay running behind them screaming. The OP and H made it to the road without incident, but when they looked back, there was no sign of Jay. They stood there for about 5 minutes, the OP's heart pounding in his chest as the adrenaline surged through him, both of them shouting Jay's name until he finally appeared out of the darkness and fell down at their feet. He looked confused and had a dull look in his eyes, so the OP and H got him up and they left the park, walking for a while but not talking about what happened. They were all in shock from what they saw. They eventually went their separate ways, but met up the next day to find that Jay was covered in black and yellow bruises. The OP posted his story online to get the opinions of others and see what they think about what happened. I've said before that you shouldn't go looking for or taunt these creatures if one is nearby, and this is a prime example of what could go wrong. However, there's no way of telling if Jay was actually beaten up by whatever he saw out there, or if he perhaps just took a nasty fall while running. The OP alluded to not fully trusting Jay in his post. Minor details I left out because it didn't really mesh with the story, but it's worth mentioning here. So I'll admit I'm a little skeptical about what happened when the OP and H made it to the road and were waiting for Jay. He very well could have had a tussle with this creature, but there's no telling what really happened. As for what they saw, the antics employed by this creature make me think Wendigo rather than Crawler. But I have recently heard that Crawlers can mimic voices too. The description fits for a Crawler, but they are very similar in appearance to a Wendigo. However, if this was a Wendigo, I don't think Jay would have made it out of the park. What do you think it was that chased them out of that park? The final story of this episode comes from Maine, where the original poster encountered something strange one night her friend says was a crawler. So she took to the internet to tell her story and seek answers. She does not say where exactly her encounter took place, just that she was in central Maine at the time. It was August of 2016 and her friend had just bought 15 acres of woods. He had invited the OP and some others to live on his land in exchange for them helping him grow a cannabis garden. She had lived there all summer in an old school bus converted into a small home. There were 7 people in total living there, and one night they were all hanging out in the community house, which was a double-wide trailer, watching movies and playing board games. The OP was tired from the day of work and said her goodnights at around 9 p.m. and left for her home to get some sleep. It was very dark out as the moon was not out yet, and she was barefoot with no flashlight. It wasn't a far walk though, and she could make it in the dark. But as she was walking past the cannabis garden, she heard the crunching of dried leaves. Something was walking toward her in the darkness. For a split second, she thought it might have been an animal, but very quickly realized that whatever was out there was walking on 2 feet. She was watching her own feet while walking, and when she looked up, she saw that a creature had stepped directly into her path. The being before her stood maybe 6 feet away and stood approximately 7 feet in height. She found herself looking straight ahead at this thing's chest. She looked up at the creature's face, and this caught her so off guard it literally took her breath away. The being's skin was a whitish color and was humanoid in appearance, but very skinny with no clothing, slender arms, and a head with no ears. As she looked at this thing's face, she saw no distinguishable features such as eyes or a mouth. She did, however, see ridges and contour markings. She says it was so dark out, it's very likely that this thing did have facial features, but she says if it did, they were too subtle for her to make out. In any case, her eyes immediately fell to the ground, almost as if they were forced. She just could not bear to look at this creature. She stood there gasping for air, wanting to scream but was unable to. She felt paralyzed by fear. As she struggled to breathe, the being standing before her stood perfectly still, unmoving. Finally, she was able to draw in a deep breath before exhaling and looking back up at its face. The creature remained motionless, watching her. Finally, her wits returned and she spun and ran back to the community house as fast as she could, screaming the whole way. When she got back and told everyone what happened, they initially thought she ran into another person who was just trying to steal the cannabis. She notes here that it was common for this to happen as the plants were flowering, so the smell was really strong. She wanted to believe this explanation, but what she couldn't understand was why the thief would walk right up to her and just stand there. She considers herself a skeptic and thinks her encounter could have just been her mind playing tricks on her, but she says that she has never been afraid of the dark or anything like that. Her friend suggested she share her story with other crawler stories to see if she could find some answers. She ends her post by saying her encounter was the strangest experience of her life. It still haunts her, and she is now afraid of the dark. This might be one of the oddest crawler stories I've done. Usually, these things are always on the move and most of the time circling people in the stories as if in a predatory way. But for it to nonchalantly walk into the OP's path and stand there looking at her? I'm not saying they couldn't or wouldn't do this, but this isn't usually how they are described acting during these encounters. The creepiest part to me is that it was too dark for the OP to get a good look at this thing's face or even make out its features. To see a being like this is one thing, but then to not be able to fully see what you're looking at? No wonder she is now afraid of the dark. Also, I'm surprised this thing didn't give chase when she ran from it. From all accounts I've heard, that's the worst thing you could do. I'm just glad she made it out of the situation safely. I do want to mention before I wrap this story up that this very well could have been an alien or a gray as they are referred to. Its appearance does match a crawler, but the way it behaved more matches a gray based on what I've heard from stories. What do you think she saw that night? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.